Hello, all. It is Sam. It is I, the author of Eathel the Bastard. Thank you so much for joining me. This is for the audio recording slash podcast version of the chapter 4. I believe we are on 4. Let me just double check to make sure that I haven't already recorded this one. Posts. Is that chapter? Published it. Oh, okay, I did. All right, well, that's great. Looks like I scheduled it to be published, so that's good. I didn't have to duplicate efforts there. Although we could kind of do some A/B testing on them and see like which one is better. But so latest chapter that came out is chapter 5. Ooh, dang it. I need to change that. Sorry, I just need to quick edit this post. I'll do that afterwards. It's not that important. I really like the poetry on this. One of them I composed like for this chapter, which is the one by Acta Viohixeno. And this would be his poem number 12. The other one comes from an older poem that I wrote myself called Heaven, and I'm putting it in I'm putting it in the pen of a guy named Salen Alahine, and this is his ninth fragment. There are some notes with a footnote if you go to the page in Substack where you can kind of learn some of the lore on there. But I really like the way that these poems came out. But here we go. Eathel the Bastard, Chapter 5, in which our recuperating hero connects with his former master. The power dynamics are now switched. Both men started as knights on the same chessboard. Now one is a king and the other a pawn. Here are the illusions. In the crystal, what you see, a school of golden waves that sigh. That's the bronze entering your eyes. West the step on aerial heights, met by the fury of its life, and the stairway to a paradise. By Acta Viohixeno, poem number 12. All the panes are in place to catch the light exact. It will come down in beams, to pirouette across the angles, and have the distance to heaven. The light wins golden as to redden, it daubs all with an extra edge of gold. And that was by Salen Alahine, and that is the ninth fragment by him. Again, you can scroll down and see, or you can click on the footnote, and it'll go. So here is our opener, just to bring you guys up to speed. In pursuit! After nearly dying and fitful nights, tormented by phantasms, AFL regains consciousness to find himself moving swiftly west in pursuit of baronial troops, making for the trade routes of the faraway Tyrrhenian coast. Upon awakening, he finds awaiting him not his father's opprobrium, but devolution of command. AFL has been made leader of the western armies of Terra, more on edge than elated. AFL knows he must strike a decisive blow against the barons before it's too late to save his home, and more importantly, his honor. I don't know what it says about a guy who cares more about honor than his home, but there might be something to that. And a quick note, AFL the Bastard is free, so you can continue to subscribe with just your email address to the newsletter. You can pre-order a paperback book that I'm going to be releasing by subscribing to the yearly plan. You don't necessarily have to renew if you catch my drift, and you'll get a copy when it comes out. All right, so, and I'd really love it if you guys could do that, and I hope you will consider it. So, the southern part of the Crestal Riandir in the Terran heartland were all amber plains of wheat and hops. Ooh, I need to change the southern parts of the Crestal Riandir in the Terran heartlands were all amber plains of wheat and hops. So that will be updated. The light worked differently here. It seemed to daub everything with extra edges of lit gold. Go, Vamp, Aethel whispered as he stood in his saddle. Vampest, his warhorse, his massive thoroughbred destrier, flew past the shuffling men in the army. As he rode by the columns of the men, he even swung his hip and locked it so that he leaned on one stirrup while counterbalancing with his other leg on Vampus' starboard side. Aethel intended the jaunty motion to take the weight off the tender leg that had just begun to itch and fill at the edges with scar. Even now it was tightly bandaged, but no longer did it pain him. It had been a week since he had collapsed on a stretcher, and his personal surgeon had been attending his leg every day since. But as he stood like that, he appeared to the men to saunter across the plains, and addressed the very wind with octorosity. The men cheered him. He did look quite heroic, if he did say so himself. And not too bad a horseman either, especially when he rocked and twitched a little bit when the terrain shifted under Van Pest. He wavered in his upright stance, but still hadn't bungled the trick too horribly in front of his men. Still keeping himself raised in the saddle, he moved his hips into a galloping stance and delicately tapped Vampa's sides, just enough to increase the animal's speed. Ecobella galloped as if her legs were condensed into a zephyr, but Vampa's gallop was the instant coruscation of lightning, splayed in a heartbeat across the firmament. Upon his war-horse, Eathel was not on a beast that heaved breath and shed heat. He was in flight upon an ominous shadow cast by a thick storm cloud. A golden hawk dipped suddenly from its lofty altitude. It dove violently, falling like a stone off of a cliff. Then Aethel's own world lurched skyward as Vampus leapt off the grassy plain. Both of them rose suddenly into the air. Aethel had wanted to see if that daring raptor would catch its prey, but his destrier Vampus spotted a furrow where Aethel wasn't looking. The quick-thinking horse accordingly jumped, jolting his rider ever so slightly off balance. Aethel recovered, and Vampus snorted amid the heavy breaths that powered his gallop. Vamp was telling Aethel to take into account all his surroundings, always. After all, the horse might not see the next one. "Sorry, Vamp," said Aethel. He patted the beautiful animal's thick neck. Vamp shone black. Aethel had not known darkness could be so bright until he first set eyes upon the foal who would come to be known as Vampest. His coat was the color of the night's reflection on a still, pool, quiet water. His coat was the color of the night's reflection on a still, quiet pool of water. Vampest ran at close to 40 miles per hour now, Aethel reckoned. He was exercising Vampest for the battle ahead. Echo, Aethel always said, was his true love, but when the swords came out, when a cavalry charge had to be mounted, then the Duchy of Terra would bring forth the key factor in their military machine, the comprehensive lethality and endless utility of their mammoth war horses, the Terran destriers. Excuse me. Another obstacle came up, and Vampest leapt. A gasp of air caught and released in Aethel's heart as he rode Vamp like a wave back down onto the other side of the jump. And just as a side note, I know I bungled the line up there that I was proud of about the pool and how that was the color of Vampest, but I did nail that one, and I am proud of it. Let's see if I can nail it again without stumbling because I'm overthinking it. Another obstacle came up, and Vampest leapt. A gasp of air caught and released in Aethel's heart as he rode Vamp like a wave back down onto the other side of the jump. "Oh, yeah." Aethel was paying attention now. He rode elegantly and sat like a gentleman of the Ars Martia, a soldier noble from the romances. Vampest was through and through a Terran destrier. He came from a lineage beginning with the war horse of the second Duke of Terra, Aethel's great-grandfather. Vampest had been trained at the ducal stables in the sprawling, shambolic Terran capital far north of here. In the midst of the grime of Shatet Terra, the city abided a silent island of sand, straw, and husbandry. It was whence the best horses in the land came, and Aethel rode one now. Aethel rode alongside his army on his way to the rear, from the rear to the avant. The hosts under him were mainly marching in a column a few men across on a wide road. They were heading west in pursuit of two fleeing baronial forces. The land around them was apportioned into thin rows of wheat fields. They were owned by small freeholders. Each hold was separated by a rough timber fence, and Aethel knew he had to take Vamp on a hurtling gallop over them. If you were going to let Vamp stretch his legs, Aethel might as well let his obsidian steed stretch his colossal legs all the way out. Every now and then a new fence would rush up. Vampest would clear it easily. His jump so casual, it was as if the horse merely strode across the chest-high pickets. The large man for whom Aethel had been squire trotted his mount up beside the young lord. The veteran soldier's surcoat was a dark charcoal black. It had a chalky white X on the front. The extenders of the X went up to his shoulders and down to the split across his hip. There was no X on the back. However, this design was the accoutrement of Haldric Adsiani's knightly order. Aethel had slowed and was panting just as Vamp was. Haldrick's large brown destrier, Mako, nuzzled at Vampest as the rider and horse settled in alongside him. Of course Haldrick was on the side where the last remnants of the bandage could be seen wrapped around his thigh. "Heard you got caught up in a mild scuffle, my lord," said Haldrick. "Nothing you didn't teach me how to handle," said Eathel. "I am sure it was not," said Haldrick. Eathel had been dreading facing this man, and glad that his former mentor had been occupied elsewhere in the army these past few days. Eathel had learned so much from this man Haldrick. Eathel now had lately made mistakes his mentor had very early taught him to avoid. Do not lose your temper. Do not act rashly. Be in control of yourself. All Eathel could hear in his head were the overlapping sounds of many Haldricks, like a stern choir in his mind, exhorting him to be temperate and wise. Haldrick looked over at Eathel, and then he looked down at the stained cloth still encircling his prodigal apprentice's limb. Though Eathel was his lord, and was as fine an apprentice as any knight could hope for, it was still hard for Haldrick to really see Eathel as a full knight. Not yet, at any rate. Too many of the young earl's blunders remained in Haldrick's memory. "It got rough," said Eathel. "Hmm," said Haldrick. "What do you want me to say?" asked Eathel. "Did not you yourself tell me that sometimes you fight for honor and you die, and sometimes you fight dirty when you have to win?" "That's right, I did, yes, lord," said Haldrick. A playful ripple curled in his lips. The older man grabbed a bit of wet Noka out of his pocket. He lodged a great glop of it into his lips. Haldrick offered some to Eathel, who took a small pinch. Eathel found wet Noka and its attendant expectoration repugnant. But sometimes, on campaign, one did what one had to do to feel good for a moment. His other mentor, the one who had instructed him in all the things about war that Haldrick had not, Haman al-Tamani, had taught him that. He still had Haman's gaudy old dagger enscabbarded at his belt, but it was but a half-foot away from the gash it had lately occupied in the meat of his leg. Eathel shoved the damp leaves up into his jaw, and soon felt the pleasant hum of the Noka. "Hard to believe this precious stuff made its way from your camp at the Barrens," said Eathel. Haldrick leaned over on his horse and spat out a bit of noxious slime. Eathel hated wet Noka. He hated spitting it, but he did what he had to do quell the gnawing in his brain that begged him for it. "That my Noka store is complete does quite strain credulity," said Haldrick. "But this army has not come all the way from your father's forward base. We were among the Western Guard." Eathel looked sidelong at him. That meant they had failed to hold the flank in the first place. "Yes," said Haldrick, "we're here to fix the very problem we were supposed to prevent. Your father is furious." Haldrick continued the dire report. "The baronial forces broke our line where I was in the smaller contingent meant to cut off their supply runs overland. Now you are to lead this endeavor, and I am to help you." There was something between them. Haldrick felt it. Eathel's shame at having almost died by his own folly. The fear that catalyzed the impulse. The embarrassment of having been so foolish to chase down a hardened mercenary, completely alone. "My lord, you ran off before your own men could even tell you that our orders were to move west en masse," said Haldrick with a pained look. Eathel looked ahead. Haldrick was disappointed. Eathel felt his doleful eyes on him, but Eathel was in no particular mood to return their look. Haldrick sighed and decided to change the key of this sullen melody. "They half broke through," Haldrick continued, "for they were a larger force than your father's commanders anticipated. This was not just a detachment moving west from the barrens, it was itself a whole army. They moved quickly out of the west through its weaker blockade. They did not go to the north, for that is where the main force of your father is. So we believe there are two forces that have become separated, both currently heading west. One of them, though farther away, is a prize indeed," Haldrick said. "How so?" asked Eathel. "The barons knew they needed their supply lines open, and they couldn't be short of funds when they made it to Carend and thence the Sea Tyrrhenian. They needed to either buy their way into existing supply lines or prepay and engage merchants on the terms of the market. They were not going to be in a position to negotiate any favorable agreements with the traders. The barons are in a panic to buy food now, and especially merchants to ship it." "They're desperate," said Aethel, "and they had to put together a lot of money very quickly." "Precisely, lord. The leaders among the barons banked their specie in a common fund administered by committee vote," said Hodrick. "They were acting more in unison this time than in the previous baronial war." But that also means their funds are accumulated, centralized, and concentrated, said AFL. Think, we cut off the river works that are their main link to their food. That is, only if we could reach them in time, Aldrich said. Their lead on us is now too wide. Both were quiet for a moment, but AFL could feel Sirixafina get to work on it. He wasn't sure what she'd come up with. Sarah might not have a plan. Any force they could ride that far, that fast, would be too lean to take on an army of even a few hundred. She hadn't bothered even to tease him much since the dream, a dream that, the further away he got from it, seemed less and less real. Because the attack wasn't viable, Haldrick, as he so often did, took advantage of an opening for levity. What's at stake is no less than their stake. Haldrick winked at AFL. The older man was given completely over to the kind of laughs that devolved into groans. So this caravan would be a tough nut to crack, offered AFL. Haldrick had to laugh at that. AFL could feel Sirixafina rolling her eyes. Haldrick, the old war dog, still could not abandon the prospect of gaining so much in their enemy's resources, perhaps the largest plunder even he had seen in his large career. It's a shipment of a lot of treasure in a small space. I alert you, Lord, to this only not as a recommendation. There are perils, said Haldrick. I'm not sure anything is possible, my lord, said Haldrick, but you should know the lay of the land. The cavalry that could get there would be tired from the ride over, with the guards of the target fit from regular strong marches, finished Aethel. Haldrick nodded. His former squire may be capricious, but he was shrewd. We saw how many those guards are, said Haldrick. They were a surprisingly fast coach for their bulk, and their rear guard were numerous. The coach itself was well armored, Haldrick continued. I would say it takes rather after a heavier caraballista, but I haven't seen one quite its like. It withstood a shot by trebuchet, at least a trebuchet of a kind. The men and horses around it burned, said Haldrick in a casual way, but the vehicle itself, the baronials hitched a train of draft horses back up to the Caraballista's evener before we could intercept. You managed to hit the thing with an artillery piece? Interrupted AFL. He had never heard of such a thing, even if it were as slow, a trundling wagon, as Haldrick had said, being able to hit a moving target. He had never heard of anything like that. Not exactly, Lord. We hit near it, said Haldrick, but your man Ballant is quite an engineer. AFL remembered he had poached the talented Ballant, a master artillery engineer, from a battalion specializing in bringing down castle walls. Ballant built you such a war engine? Asked AFL. I myself sent him back to the capital. No, Lord, he was not there, but it was his design, said Haldrick. He made it and submitted it to the war group at the Tandrat, and it recently has been approved by your father. This was its first test. And this engine is capable of hitting a target not standing still? One in motion? Asked AFL. Within reason, Lord, said Haldrick. The battery is quite ingenious. Your man Ballant has put a shot mechanism as strong as any ballista on a wheel that can be turned by three men, or two strong ones, by way of handles standing on either side, attached to the wheel. The wheel lies flat upon the ground, Haldrick went on. It can turn this way and it can turn in this way in a complete circuit and continuously. Though it's smaller, it can be relatively quickly moved if the edges of the circle are coated with the right oil. The right kind of oil. AFL shook his head and smiled to himself. Haldrick Adsiani, gentleman knight, was infamous for delighting in every tiny detail of anything that came into his experience. Haldrick had to know and understand how everything worked, and what made it work well. What did they call it? Asked AFL. It was originally called Balance Turner, said Haldrick, but the men shortened it to Balancer, and it stuck. Few know of it outside of a small crew of artillery, but it was used for the first time there at the western blockade of the Barrens. There's an argument about the plan, and there's an argument against it, my lord, said Haldrick. Aethel would need to think quickly, but he knew Sarah was already working out the details. All right, thank you for joining. That's the end. We're just going to go on to the illusions. These are in-world building devices. These are the footnotes. But if you're not interested in this, I get it. Just skip ahead. So this is footnote number 1 from that poem. The poem is number 22 of his. So this is Acta Viohixeno, poem number 22. So in the crestal, what you see, a school of golden waves at side, that's the bronze entering your eyes. West the steppe on aerial heights, met by the fury of its life. and the Stairway to a Paradise. And that's by Acta Vioxeno, and that's his 22nd poem. I guess he didn't title that one. And also, that's not the complete poem. That's just kind of a part that's relevant to the chapter. And then this one from Seylan Dalahain. All the panes are in place to catch the light exact. It will come down in beams to pirouette across the angles and have the distance to heaven. The light wins golden as to redden. It daubs all with an extra edge of gold. And that is the ninth fragment of Seylan Alahain. So underneath both of those allusions, there's a line that says "See notes on Vioxeno and Alahain." So I'm going to click that. So Vioxeno in poem number 22 and Alahain, that poem's fragment number 9, are both authors representative of the Soloway period in Terran literary history. Although mostly associated with the Neo-Soloway movement, Vioxeno's work is more broad, focusing on his adopted home in the southern Terran heartland, an uncommon theme for poets at court. Remember, right now, these guys are in that southern Terran heartland. That's part of why this poem was chosen. Vioxeno's verse also emphasizes his Dostraterran roots, something altogether unusual for a time where Dostraterrans were seen as a lower sort than most Terrans. The two were contemporaries who vacillated between collaboration and contumely, but both continue to be highly regarded. Alahain, that's the second one, is generally accepted as the superior writer, but Vio Hixeno, often referred to as Veo, has a long history of touching hearts of a particular variety. And this was from a report on prominent historical artists suspected of sedition, prepared for the Lidamel Council of the Tandrat, originally presented as a dissertation at the University of Ionessa as Terran Literature of the Pre-Entitlement Era, and that was by Den Theron, member of the College of Guiding Lights. The second, so this is in reference to the Noka, which may have sounded a lot like chewable tobacco because that is definitely one of the bases for it. It's a little bit different though, but it's basically tobacco, a stronger form of it. So, Noka is a stronger version of tobacco that can be smoked or chewed. It's cultivated in the same way with the same soil effects, meaning that it is taxing on the soil. The economy of much of western Dastraterra, where Eathel's father, Hastus, the fifth Duke of Terra, met his common-born mother, Baria, consists primarily of Noka latifundia. If you don't know that word latifundia, that's not an in-world, that is a real world word. It means like a plantation. I believe in Spain, but that's what they called it, but I could be completely wrong. I probably am actually. But Noca also can be processed in such a way that it can be rendered into various forms of stimulants in varying degrees of potency. So be on the lookout for Noca-derived substances ranging from cocaine-like powders to small gelatin capsules that can keep guards on watch for hours on end. AFL highly prizes Noca and Noca-derived products. You may have noticed he's addicted to it. He hates it wet. So there's wet Noca and then smokable Noca. And smokable Noca would be like smoking a little like cigarillo kind of thing, or in a pipe. And the wet Noca would be like chewing tobacco, and you get the nicotine high from it crossing the blood or the blood barrier, or the it absorbs the nicotine through your gums. And because it's tobacco, you have to spit it out, and it's pretty gross. He does not like it, and he later on becomes kind of a little bit unpopular for banning spittoons at pretty much any event where he can get away with it. Spittoons are what people used to just have like indoors for spitting tobacco. They were heinous, but AFL loves smoking tobacco or Noka, and is definitely one of the more you know more addicted of the people in his posse, but many people smoke Noka. It's especially popular among the younger, more daring set. It's seen as a little bit dangerous, much like actual tobacco was when it was introduced in actual real world history. Um, and I'm focused mostly on the tobacco introduced into, by John Rolfe from the Jamestown colony. He was using, what was it like? Like the Native Americans in what is today the United States did like Nicotiana rustica, and then John Rolfe had found another Nicotiana something. and brought it over to the Jamestown colony and turned it into a cash crop that really sustained that colony and allowed it to grow. So all of those lands down there in Virginia originally, I mean, they may have had something else stick over the while, uh, over time. The British might have, or the English might have, been able to set something up other over time, but the way that it actually happened was that tobacco was the foundation of all of it. And this is the third and final footnote. It's just adding in some help for people who are maybe a little bit lost as to what's going on. Where, with regard to what the Duke of Tara, that's Eathel's father, is up to. So earlier on, we got into a part where Haldric Adsiani, who is based on a gentleman named Ken Roselli, by the way. And there was earlier I was mentioning another guy on the siege, um, like team who, was going to be a basis for Ken Roselli, but um, Caravaggio Rosell. But I actually started to really like Haldrick, and I got a very Ken avuncular energy from him, and so I'd like to pursue that if that's okay with you, Ken. There's still going to be a Caravaggio Rosell, but he's going to be a villain now. But very important for me to note that have been your soul, your essence has been transferred over to Haldric Adsiani, and Caravaggio Rosell is going to be more villainous. So not you, Caravaggio. You are Haldric Adsiani. The Duke of Tara had at this point, so this is where that conversation is happening between Haldric and Eathel, where they're going over like what exactly why they're in this situation where they're chasing these two baronial forces and how those forces wound up being two at all. So there's a footnote there that goes down to the Duke of Tara had at this point in the conflict bifurcated his expeditionary force into two blockades of the baronial lands. Outside of a few skirmishes at this point in what would later be known as the Second Baronial War, the main conflict was around supply lines and the flow thereof. Among the main grievances of the barons were the embargoes assessed them by the Duchy of Tara, for Tara allowed little to be bought or sold unto baronial lands without collecting heavy excise on its traffic. For the barons, the politics and geography made opening supply lines to the east and south unviable, due to hostile relations in the former and geographical considerations in the latter. The barons' lands were typically innervated by fluvial arteries, which is to say they relied on the wide, rich rivers flowing to their north for food and trade. This is where the Duke of Tara established his main blockade, dispatching a smaller contingent to block the barons' western routes of escape. Their path was harder in the west, for the barons, that is. It's a rockier terrain, kind of based on the Shenandoah Valley of the United States, which is in the western part of the United States state of Virginia. And the thinking of the leadership was that a smaller force could hold down the West just because of that terrain. They didn't think that the barons were going to send many people there. The barons calculated that a weaker force would be guarding their path on the way, the weaker force being the Terrans, and sent a far larger army that smashed through the lighter Western Terran lines and pressed on toward the rocky ridges of the Sulacani Woods, which is a region within this Shenandoah Valley that is a very broad, long, continental kind of Shenandoah Valley. In any maps posted, the Barons' holdings will be marked in red. You can find the map on some places. I may need to post another picture of it because I've drawn some places as they become relevant to the story. But there will also be areas that are shaded in red to highlight areas of baronial sympathy within the broader Terran conglomerate to kind of reflect a more fluid and shifting sense of loyalties. You'll see a lot of Barons' sympathies lying along river lines because the barons really drive a lot of the trade along the river. So kind of some in-world building there. All right, well, thank you guys. Stay tuned for chapter 6 coming next Wednesday.